What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today I'm going to be sharing with you how I use layers in street photography. We'll be looking at some behind the scenes of my photographs, breaking down the context sheets, and even looking at some behind the scenes videos at the scene. And so I've been practicing street photography for the past decade, honing in on my craft, and I've mastered the art of layering. And I believe this is a technique and a thing that we should all add to our tool belts as street photographers, as ultimately a street photographer is merely responsible for where they position their physical body in relationship to the subject and the background. And so layering is a very foundational concept that we should hone in on in order to improve our photography. And so without further ado, let's jump right into the video. And so today we'll be discussing how I use layers in street photography. First and foremost, I believe it's important to recognize that mastering layers requires practice, patience, and persistence. This is something that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a week, a month, a few months, or even a year. You're going to have to go out there with discipline each and every day, practicing your photography in the open world, actually doing the thing itself in order to improve your photography. But ultimately in this video, we're going to cover some of the key concepts that you can adopt and utilize when you're out there on the streets. And so at the end of the day, the most important aspect of layering that I can think of is to be patient. I mean, this is very critical. When you see something that's interesting, when you sense the possibility of a photograph, don't just press the shutter once and move on. In order to create these dynamic layered compositions, you're gonna have to take a lot of photographs. You know, when you find a scene or a moment or something that's really interesting to you, stay as long as you can. You know, what I like to do is I don't leave the scene until the scene leaves me. And so this to me is the secret of layering. You know, for me, when I made this photograph here at Bandra Fort in Mumbai, India, I roamed around this location for a good 20, 30 minutes. And then I spent the next hour to 2 hours enjoying the sunset, roaming around, practicing my photography in various locations, observing the scene. I could sense the possibility. I noticed the beautiful birds and the way that they flew, and the golden hour was striking, and there were so many people with colorful outfits, and there was such possibility here. You know, I observed the different windows and the way I could use geometry and form, and I practiced here time and time again. And I spent the entirety of the sunset in order to achieve this photograph. And so I spent a lot of time here. I was very observant here. And so patience is critical. And now we're going to look at the behind the scenes of how this photograph was made here in Baltimore. Yes. The bird, the bird. I want one, and then the bird. And so, at this scene, I want to emphasize that I'm very observant of the patterns that exist in both nature, with the light, the birds in flight, and human behavior, the way they move, gesture, and position themselves throughout my stage here. And in order to create a layered composition, in order to set your stage and to allow the stars to align very naturally, I believe we should operate in a very particular way. And so what I did here at the scene was plug my background in first and foremost. And so you see here we have a window frame. And I positioned this man within that window frame as the very first element to this composition in order for me to create this form, to create this shape here, using the windows and using the shapes, using the lines and the formal elements within this composition to create the layers and the dynamics within the frame. And so I like to oftentimes hone in on the background first and foremost. Of course, I sensed the possibility of the bird in flight. This was something I was waiting for as the cherry on top. However, I believe in order to achieve these layered and dynamic compositions, we should work from back to front. And so by positioning that man in the window, I was able to set my stage. And so I simply was patient. I observed as this man was within the window, and I plugged in these different elements here within the foreground with the woman and their gestures with their hands. And I had two elements already good to go. I was observant of the way that people were walking and positioning their bodies in front of this fort. Many people were tourists, many people were taking photos, and I could essentially sit here, fish around with patience, and wait for the stars to align. Wait for the lucky, spontaneous moment of that bird in flight. And so you can really force your luck by being ultra observant. And so by working back to front, by plugging in the window, and by waiting for the people to enter the front of my frame, I was able to achieve this composition and have the bird come into the frame at the perfect time when I press the shutter. And so visual problem solving. Photography is visual problem solving, and I believe that we as photographers must position our physical bodies in relationship to the subject, in relationship to the scene, and make order out of the chaos. And so this is a very simple approach by working back to front and observing this scene through the behind the scenes and discussing some of my ideas about how I made this photograph through patience, observation, and fishing at the scene, taking lots of photos. I hope you can understand how these kind of frames come together. And so life is like a visual puzzle, and the photographer is responsible for solving these puzzles. And so the question you should ask yourself when you're approaching a scene is, where must I position myself for the puzzle pieces to align? When I was in Mumbai, I aligned myself in front of the fort, using the windows as a framing technique or a tool to create that puzzle, to create and finish my composition. And so when I went out in Baltimore in the hope of photographing this rainbow, which was something I did intentionally, I essentially packed my umbrella, my raincoat, and packed my Ricoh GR2 and went out with the intention of photographing a rainbow. And as I roamed around West Baltimore here, I wound up finding myself at this scene at the corner. And for me to create this composition, I had to simply put my body in a position to create the layers here. And so essentially, you see the composition is actually very simple. I have this composition broke down from this wall here on the left-hand side, and I have the rainbow here on the right-hand side. And so the simple solution for me at this scene was to position my physical body in relationship to the rainbow and this subject in the foreground. And so this man here in the foreground that I'm circling was what I used as an anchor point. And so I like to find these choke points when I make these layered compositions, a place where I can position my body and a place for me to sort of watch as people walk in and out of a scene. And that's how I wound up finding myself photographing the spontaneous moment of this man with the umbrella. It was through positioning myself on a particular sidewalk in a way that I could play at the scene and sense the possibility of somebody walking into the frame or moving in and out of the frame, where I had a man that was just happened to be drinking his coffee outside of a shop, and I noticed the man in the middle ground that was chilling against the wall. And because of those simple dynamics, I was able to set this scene, and I was able to wait patiently by plugging, once again, the background first. The rainbow was the first thing that I plugged into this composition, right? And so I was working back to front. I made sure to emphasize the rainbow in the frame by making sure it's taking up over half of my photograph. And coming back to the front with the man in the coffee, we have a surprise on the left-hand side of the woman in the window. So we have two surprises here that I highlighted in yellow. We have the man with the umbrella in perfect stride and the woman in the window. However, by positioning myself in a way where I could sense the possibility of dynamics and people moving in and out of the frame, I was pleasantly surprised with these two decisive moments. And it's very similar to the bird in flight. When you can sense the possibility that a bird will come into your frame, when you can sense the possibility that people are walking in and out of a coffee shop, you can find yourself surprised through the frames that you make, where the woman in the reflection and the man in stride were something that was out of my control. But by positioning myself in a particular way, at a particular time, in a particular place, I was able to force my luck. I was able to create order out of the chaos within this composition. And so, very similar to the previous frame, working back to front, feeling my rainbow, and then waiting as people come in and out of the frame. And so, these kind of techniques, these kind of ideas, and my approach to creating these layered compositions is something I follow through with throughout the entire world. And so here in Mexico, in this photograph we're going to be looking at, it took a lot of clicks. You know, I was hanging out at this scene for a good amount of time, probably a half hour to 45 minutes, and I hiked to the top of a mountain and found myself at this beautiful scene. And very similar to these previous frames, I'm working back to front. I'm finding the element that intrigues me, waiting, I'm patient, and then I essentially create order out of the frame. And so a lot of photographs need to be made, a lot of time needs to be spent, and you have to become closer and closer to life to come home with these photos. And so we're going to go ahead and just click on the video and look at the behind the scenes and show you how this photo was made. And one thing I want to point out before I hit play is listen to my audio. Let me make sure the audio is on. Listen to what I say about the statue of Jesus.
In the right spot, you can get Jesus in the guys.
México, así te puro Cruz Azul. Aquí, fíjate, ve. México, mira, México, Cruz Azul, México, Cruz Azul, ¡ey! ¡Puro Cruz Azul!
Oh!
¡Puro Cruz Azul! ¡Puro Cruz Azul! Ya,
Sorry.
México, puro Cruz Azul!
Bro, gracias.
So hopefully you could hear what I said in the beginning of the video where I was discussing that I can make a composition here in relationship to that sculpture. When I approached the scene in Mumbai, I could sense the possibility of something occurring with the bird in flight. When I approached the rainbow in Baltimore, I could sense the possibility as people moved in and out of the scene. When I approached this scene here in Mexico City, I looked at that sculpture. I looked at that beautiful mountain range. I could sense the possibility of something occurring here. And through that spirit of play and through me being there and being present at this scene, I made this photograph here that actually has some interesting dynamics to dissect. And so essentially what was most intriguing to me in the moment that I will highlight in red is that sculpture of Jesus. And so I plugged that in as an anchor point within my composition, similar to me setting my stage with that man in the window in Mumbai, India, or the rainbow in Baltimore. And so by recognizing something that triggers you, you position yourself in relationship to that thing. And so as the scene unfolded very spontaneously and very playfully, this man had his arms outstretched, that I'm going to highlight here in yellow, very similarly to the sculpture of Jesus, to that statue with his arms outstretched. This is the spontaneous moment. This is the unpredictability. This is what it means to put order to chaos. This is something very spontaneous, and I believe that ultimately composition is very intuitive. And when you press the shutter, you're pressing the shutter through that gut. And when he opened his arms and he was exclaiming Mexico with his mouth open, providing this very mysterious, emotional, sort of visual gesture on his face, everything else aligned. This dog swooped by, the bag lined up perfectly, his hat is on the ground. We have in the background the storm clouds coming over the horizon from the mountain. And this came through recognizing the potential of a photograph. This came through me recognizing something that triggers me, such as the sculpture of Jesus. And then being there and being playful and spending lots of time, making lots of photos at the scene, not being afraid to engage with humanity and handshaking the man afterward, and just having a joyful experience when I'm on the streets, hiking a mountain with one of my friends and having a good time and lusting for life. Ultimately, I believe when you're out there and you're engaging with humanity and you make a photograph, that will reflect your lust for life. And so a photographer must be out there in the open world. You know, if you want to go up there and hike a mountain, you're going to have to go out there and hike a mountain to make these kind of photographs. You're going to have to be an open world explorer at the forefront, engaged and close to humanity. As much as I can tell you the technique on how I'm making these compositions, I hope to also emphasize the very simple fact that you must go out there in the world and do the thing. And so, building off of that, I believe it's important to build relationships, to spend some time with your subjects. This will allow more deeper and more dynamic compositions, similar to that photograph that you just saw from the mountaintop in Mexico City. I spent a lot of time in Jericho City, here in Palestine, and I was observant of the way in which the men would pray in the mosques. And through my curiosity, I began to pray in the mosque amongst the group of brothers. And so after I would pray in the mosque, I would exit and I would sit around with a group of elders drinking coffee as they smoked cigarettes. And I essentially spent a lot of time outside of mosques, just chatting with strangers and observing the everyday life and the routine of the Palestinians here in Jericho. And by building these intimate relationships and spending time with the subjects in my photographs, I'm able to come home with these more intimate, emotionally impactful and visually impactful photographs that use the layering technique, as you can see as we have the kiss, the gesture, the coffee, and the cigarette there in the background, putting together a composition that not only has strong form, but has strong content within the frame. And so on one of my occasions when I was praying in the mosque, a group of brothers noticed me and they invited me to their home to drink some coffee. And as I spent time with them, we wound up hiking or riding in a little road trip to the top of the mountain range, another mountain scene here in the Wadi Kelt mountain range in Jericho. And as we hugged and chugged up the mountain in these old beat up cars, one of the vehicles broke down at the scene. And so the group of men got out of the car and they started to push it up the hill. And I had to make a compositional decision here. As you can see in this contact sheet, I've made a variety of frames here at the scene. I got out of the car, I was photographing from the window, I was photographing from the window looking outside. I tried a couple of different things here, but ultimately what I did to achieve this composition was very simple. And so, as you see on the left-hand side of the frame, I decided to make my initial photograph of the scene by looking at the car in relationship to the mountain and the background. However, it fell flat. And so in order for me to improve this composition and add that extra layer, I incorporated the foreground of that vehicle that I was standing behind. And so this was a very simple composition to make. It was a very simple solution to make. However, it required me to be on my toes and to respond quickly at the scene. A car breaks down and you're observing this fleeting moment. How are you going to create this layered composition that tells the story of that moment? And so my decision was to include in the foreground of the frame that vehicle in order to add layers, add depth, and it becomes a very simple composition. When you look at this, I'm simply using the car as the foreground element. I'm using the mountains as the middle ground, and then finally filling the sky in the background with the beautiful clouds. It was a very simple compositional decision to hone in on that car in the foreground. When you break down the frame and I draw over it, you can see how simple it really is, how much I honed in on the use of layering here. It was very, very intuitive for me to make this compositional decision. And oftentimes, if you fill your foreground with something striking, maybe even it takes up 1/3 of the frame, you can achieve a more dynamic and impactful photograph. And so this was a situation where I responded very quickly and filled my foreground in order to make that relationship to the background. And so as I spent my time in Jericho, I had so many opportunities to photograph youthful energy of children on the street. This was something very available to me as a photographer walking around these communities where I would find the Palestinian youth to just be out there and I would observe them, and I was very playful, and I would oftentimes walk around beatboxing and have a flock of Palestinian children just following me throughout the town, and I found myself playing at certain scenes and just enjoying myself like a childlike explorer. And so I was very playful at this scene, and I think my playful energy reflects in the photograph, and by embracing the chaos, by embracing the spontaneity, life will give you surprises. And so as you can see in this photograph, I'm actually at the border of Jericho. In the top right corner, you see an Israeli settlement overlooking this refugee camp. And so we have an interesting scene. We have the playful youth despite their living conditions. We have their joy. We have their presence here on this empty frame, using what they got to play and to find joy in their everyday life. And so this photograph came through setting the stage, through looking at my background and recognizing that hillside. And so I filled half of the frame with the background element and plugged the foreground in by looking at that boy hanging on to the pole. And so, to be honest with you, as I was positioning my body and aligning myself within this situation and finding that choke point, all I really did was I positioned myself in relationship to the boy on the pole in the foreground and the background and the hillside. And then these two elements that I'm going to highlight here in yellow with the hands and the boy on the bottom left fell together spontaneously as I clicked the shutter more and more and pretty much just waited observant and was observant and patient at the scene. And so, yeah, a lot of the time when you're photographing in these chaotic scenes, all you really need to do is position yourself in the chaos. All you really need to do is get really close to these chaotic moments and make a few relationships, and everything else will kind of just fall into place. And so we must find the sweet spot. You know, for me, when I made that photograph, I found the sweet spot. You know, I was there. I was watching as the boy played on that pole in relationship to the boy on the left that was also playing on the pole, and that hillside in the background, and then the other elements fell together. And so positioning and intuition are key to layered compositions. And so here in Napoli, I was on a vacation with my brother Julian, and we were enjoying ourselves along the rocks here at the scene. And this came through time spent. We were simply there enjoying ourselves, and it was a vacation. I wasn't actually there to make any photographs or thinking about photography. However, by having my camera with me at this scene, it really did pay off. And so always carry a camera with you, because the best photographs happen when you least expect it. And so we were sunbathing, swimming, enjoying ourselves, and these men began to break out a watermelon as we started to chat with the locals. They were feeding me live fish at the scene, breaking off clams from the rocks, and then they took out this watermelon spontaneously from the sea, and they used that as a natural refrigerator. And as they broke the watermelon and shared it amongst their friends and shared it amongst me and my brother, I wound up making this photograph. And so essentially, as you can see in the context sheet, what I'm highlighting here is I'm trying to find that sweet spot where I can essentially combine the foreground and the background to create a layered composition, looking at that swimmer as the anchor point, as the sweet spot. And so the swimmer is what I believe brings this frame together. The swimmer in the background was what I was using as my anchor point. And so you really need to find that sweet spot, right? And so, like many of the ways I make these layered compositions, I essentially plugged this man that's swimming as my anchor point. I put him in, you know, he was like the target that I was scanning, and I was moving my body around and trying to position myself in a way where I could relate the foreground energy of and the color of the watermelon to that man swimming in the background, because ultimately this photograph would have fallen flat had I not included that man in the background. And so I was using him as my anchor point. I was trying to find that sweet spot. I was moving around, and ultimately through positioning my body in relationship to that background element, my foreground element fell into place naturally, as we have the watermelon and we have the man taking up 1/3 of the frame, once again filling the frame in the foreground to add impact. And then on the left hand side we have the other man. And so this composition is something that came through finding the sweet spot, once again finding that anchor that ties things together by scanning the background and making relationships between the foreground and the background. I was able to create this composition with layers, and ultimately this is something that I do time and time again. Is I find a sweet spot, I'm patient, I'm observant, and the other pieces kind of align together naturally, intuitively, really. But you got to find that choke point, you got to find that anchor and hone in on that, and then position your body and orient yourself in order to make these kind of layered compositions. And so I was very observant of that scene. I was simply allowing it to unfold naturally. I'm very aware of the background. I'm very aware of the different elements that are occurring within my frame. I'm aware of the color popping from the watermelon. And then ultimately, I'm trying to position my body and my camera at the best angle to synthesize the composition from the foreground, middle ground, and background. And so at this scene in Jericho, I was walking around and I noticed this boy playing with a tire. And as you can see in the context sheet, I was initially photographing this boy with the tire, and I was following these boys with the tire. I thought it was an interesting moment. I wanted to make a photo of him. And then ultimately it led me into this construction site where I used the construction site and I used the window frame as a compositional technique or a visual element in my frame to achieve this layered composition. And so at the end of the day, I simply position my body inside this construction site to add more visual interest within the photograph itself, because photographing the boy with a tire isn't as interesting as photographing the boy with the tire in relationship to the texture of the wall and the construction site here at this scene. And so a very simple idea to hone in on is perhaps the angle in which I photographed. You can see the keeper photo there. I was at a slight angle. I was looking at the light and shadow. I also tried to make photographs like this. However, they fall a bit more flat. And so I liked how the window frame was positioned on the right-hand side, and I believe it makes more dynamic and interesting visuals within this frame itself, where I didn't necessarily think that this photograph was the keeper, because essentially it falls too flat for me. I don't like the two-dimensionality of it, but I tried to position my body at a particular angle that added more depth. And I also like the gaze of this boy. And so you can see the boy's gaze, the tension of him looking down in relationship to this boy here in the window with the tire. Very simple frame, very simple decision to use the window as a tool for me to create a layered composition, very similar to the photograph you saw from Mumbai. And so working back to front, allowing the boy with the tire to be my anchor, and then positioning my body in relationship to that boy with the tire and the boy in the foreground, and then coming home with this photograph as the keeper, as his gesture, and the light and the shadow and the texture all kind of fell together naturally here. And so gesture is super important, right? Gesture is ultimately a lot of the times what ties together a frame, right? When you look at the context sheet, the gesture of the boy, the gesture of him gazing downward, not looking directly at the camera, or just having a stronger and more compelling gesture adds emotion, it adds depth to the photo, and it sometimes these very small details bring the photo to life. By watching the face, the hands, the feet, the way people move, it can seriously elevate the photos that we make. And so in this scene here at Shafat refugee camp in East Jerusalem, I photographed this Palestinian man with a watermelon, and I'm going to share with you now the behind the scenes and how this photograph was made was simply put through the spirit of play, from me being there, being close to people, engaging with some conversation, just being playful, and then just being observant of the light and shadow and pressing the shutter at that right moment. And so we'll look at the behind the scenes right now.
I'm from America. Yes. Trump? Maniac. Yeah. He's crazy, a little crazy. Yeah. In America, I live in Philadelphia. Yes. Oh, nice. Oh, cool. Miami's beautiful. Forza Saída.
All right, so what I observed initially at this scene was the beautiful popping color, that green color of the watermelon, the striking light and shadow. And I could sense the possibility of a photograph here. I moved around the scene. I made lots of photographs. I engaged. I had a dialogue with the people as I entered this community. This was one of the first photographs I made when I entered this place, and it came through me just being open and being conversational. And then eventually the man took the watermelon up onto his head, and I made this photograph. And I just want to highlight here that light is out of our control, right? And so what that means is I couldn't necessarily tell you that I knew that this light and shadow play would occur by his gesture there on his face. And so that gesture of his smile, that joy, really ties together the photograph emotionally as much as the gesture of his hand and the movement that ties together the watermelon here and the watermelon there elevate the frame. I think that ultimately I could sense the possibility of a photograph here because of the light. You can see my shadow here. There's a shadow casted there. There's lots of depth and deep, dark black shadow there in the background. And it was very simple, excuse me, to make this frame because I was patient, I was observant of the light, and then a moment happened spontaneously and was the delight that made the photograph, that tied this moment together. So a lot of the times light can actually also be a way for you to create more dynamic and layered compositions by being at a location or shooting at a certain time, like the golden hour, where you have long looming shadows, where you have more dynamics to work with. And so that's the behind the scenes of the watermelon in Jerusalem. And so as I made that photograph, I didn't just start make a photo and walk away. I photographed through the scene. I photographed frequently at that scene. I made a lot of photographs. It took a lot of clicks to make the shutter. I essentially didn't leave the scene early, right? You don't want to leave the scene too early. You want to allow the moment to sort of develop naturally and sort of just watch and observe, as life spontaneity is out of our control. And so you must simply be patient and never leave the scene too early. This is a very important tip. Here at this scene, again, observing the light, sensing the possibility of a photograph because of it, and watching as people moved in and out of the light, observing the way the shadow play occurred at this scene at the bus stop, finding my anchor point, similar to the previous compositions that we were talking about, where I found this sign in the background, I found this light in the foreground as these very two interesting elements, and finding myself and positioning myself at the perfect angle to combine those two elements, and then waiting for the spontaneity of the man coming into the light and observing the light and shadow play and the way the silhouette filled the frame. I was able to make this composition. And so working back to front, sensing the possibility of a photograph, observing the light and shadow and the way that these elements interplayed at the scene in order to create layers and to create depth. But I always, a lot of the times I find an anchor. I'm looking at that sign, I'm plugging in my background, I'm observant of the light, and then the spontaneous nature of light and life take over as I'm there and ready and prepared to press the shutter. And so I'm going to be sharing with you a behind the scenes moment where I photograph a rainbow here in my hometown, Philadelphia. Let's go ahead and just look at I didn't include the behind the scenes video. I should have included that, but it's all good. There's a video. If you type in on YouTube, Dante Sisypho, rainbow in Philadelphia, you'll be able to find it. However, at this scene, I spent a lot of time in the fountain. I was observant. I was walking around the fountain over and over again, trying to make a photograph of this rainbow. And it came through me being at a very particular angle. I needed to find the perfect angle, the perfect choke point to allow this composition to even occur, where that rainbow was only visible from a very specific vantage point. And I had to get close with courage at the forefront, entering the arena, going into the water, getting wet, being there and being present when I pressed the shutter. And by positioning myself in a particular way, I was able to make the relationships of these dynamics here at this scene by being close to the place where the boy is playing and jumping from the sculpture there, and positioning the rainbow, filling up half of the frame to give emphasis and impact within the composition. And then all of the elements that occurred throughout the frame were very spontaneous, like that fountain there that also has an arch on the top left of the frame, and how that relates to the arch of the rainbow. These spontaneous moments occur through simply being at the right place at the right time and finding that choke point, finding that angle to make the photograph. And so when I photographed this next scene that you'll see of my grandmother here on the rooftop in Philadelphia, I was essentially doing a very similar technique of positioning my body at the right place. By dropping to a low angle, I was able to give my composition more visual impact by honing in on this gesture, by honing in on the red lipstick, by honing in on the red nails, and by honing in on that gesture itself as a compositional tool to break up the frame. And so in order for me to create this composition with layers, I needed to make the physical decision of dropping low and getting close. And so that element of the frame takes up about 1/3, if not half, of the composition. And so as I dropped to a low angle through my intuition and made the photograph, a lot of the different pieces fell together naturally, where we have that cloud in the sky, we have the skyscrapers here, and then the middle ground gesture of the man with his hand on the back, and then some of the people here hanging out on the right-hand side fell together naturally in relationship to the way in which I positioned my camera at a low angle to that gesture. And so gestures trigger me. Gestures are something that I look for, and I believe that ultimately you need to make the decision on where you physically position yourself to make the photograph. When I was at the scene photographing the rainbow in the fountain, I needed to be close to that fountain. I needed to particularly have my body at an angle to view the rainbow. Here at this scene, I had to drop low to emphasize that gesture, to create these dynamics within my frame. And so chaos excites me. And I believe that if you simply put your body and your camera in a particular place at a particular time in a chaotic scene, whether it's a chaotic playground, a market, etc., a lot of the spontaneous nature of life will simply be a surprise to you. And I think if you simply go and embrace chaos, you can put order to it as these events sort of just unfold naturally. And yeah, I believe that unpredictability is where magic happens. And so here in Mumbai at this scene, I simply remained playful. I was at a playground and I could sense the possibility of a photograph here because of the chaos. There was just so many dynamics. There was almost too much chaos at this scene. It was so chaotic. But spontaneously, as I was photographing and positioned myself in this chaotic environment, an element of this toy gun here and the gaze of that boy there were simple elements, simple details that honestly I didn't notice in the moment. The gun came out very spontaneously, and of course I noticed it when it was pulled out, but I couldn't predict that. I couldn't tell you that, oh, this is something I saw before I photographed this scene. I was simply there and present at the scene and allowing the chaos to fuel me, and that's how this composition was made. This is an example of just embracing chaos, and then we have the spontaneous facial expression of the girl with the band-aid on her face, and a lot of different elements fall into place here with this boy looking over, looking down, bringing the composition together by looking down towards that gun. And there's this sort of like spiral here in the composition that simply came through putting my body in a position that embraced the chaos and the unpredictability of life. And again, that's where the magic happens. And so as we embrace chaos, recognize that layering isn't about following any rigid rules. Layering is about curiosity, presence, and intuition, ultimately. You don't necessarily need to follow any guidelines on how to make these kind of compositions. I'm just sharing with you some of the things that I've picked up along my journey that have influenced me in the way that I make these photographs. And so I hope that some of the ideas I shared with you will benefit you along your journey, and ultimately, you must trust your vision. I think that when you sense the possibility of a photograph, be patient, be observant, follow your intuition. When I was photographing here at this scene in Mexico City, I noticed the beautiful light and shadow. I noticed the colorful mural, and I could sense the possibility of something here as people moved in and out of the scene. But it wasn't until I pressed the shutter at this moment as the man pulled these carts into the shadow area that I was able to make the relationship from the foreground to the background, of the hands on the man to the hands on the mural, to the absence of his face and his eyes, to the presence of the face and the eyes in the background, right? This is something that happens very much through our gut, through our intuition, and through our observation. And so hone in on that sharp visual acuity that you must possess as a photographer. So your observation skills, your two eyes and your two legs are what's going to determine the result of the photograph, not following any guidelines or rules or rigid sort of, ways in which you photograph. And so I'm just going to share with you a couple different tips here to wrap things up. Shoot a lot and be patient. Engage with subjects. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and to engage with people. Focus on the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Again, a photographer is responsible for where they position themselves in relationship to the subject and the background. And when they press the shutter, right? This is what photography is at the end of the day. So when I photograph, I like to, a lot of the time, set my stage. I work from back to front. I find my background first and allow the other pieces to fall together. And so by observing a scene, by finding your background and positioning your camera intentionally, hopefully you can achieve stronger photographs. And so some of the other tips I have for you is look for gestures and movements, take risks, embrace chaos, the spontaneous nature of life. This is where the magic happens. And remember that photography is visual problem solving. And at the end of the day, you got to spend time. You got to be observant. You have to be patient when you're making these kind of photographs. It's going to take a lot of clicks, a lot of movement, a lot of, being patient, being observant, right? It's not a one and done quick flyby snapshot, but it's you observing the beauty of light, observing the beauty of life, sensing the possibility of something occurring, and then making those relationships through the way that you photograph at a scene by observing the stage, by observing the background, by observing the movement of people and the different elements that make up life. When we're photographing life. When I photographed this scene, I was there. I was present when I pressed the shutter. As much as I can teach you the compositional techniques that I use when I'm on the street, you got to go out there and explore the world. You have to be present when you press the shutter. To make that photograph in Zambia, I rode my bike for 2 hours to another village and spent the day there waiting for the sunset to make that frame. And then spontaneously observed as the children were playing. And I could sense the possibility as light and shadow interplayed, as they interacted with that empty frame. And while the ideas I share with you about composition are certainly helpful, I need to encourage you to go out there and do the thing. Make use of these tips, practice these techniques, and hopefully you can improve the way that you use layering in your street photography. Thank you for watching. I will see you in another video. Peace.